Every day we have over 4,000 advertisements that come our way. They come our way and they are in different forms, and no matter what they are marketing, what they're really selling is rest. They're selling rest. So regardless of the product, they're trying to really tap into and monetize our desire for rest. You have a couple here sitting in chairs, lounging in the white sand beach. You have the aqua green water, right? You have that little red bucket with a yellow shovel. But I don't know where the kids are. You know why there are no kids on the picture? Kids equal no rest, right? And so there are no kids on the picture, but they want to seem like they're loving, so they put that in there. But they are trying to tap into something there. Why? We live in a hurried and exhausted world that is restless. We are restless in the world in which we live. And people know that, and they're trying to encourage and monetize that, or as Ronald Rolheiser said, we have a cancerous restlessness. It's like a terrible disease, that we are just chronically restless. It was the great 4th century North African theologian Augustine who said, speaking of God, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Without God in our lives, we are restless people. And here's why. Our desires are infinite. You can never satisfy a human desire. It's infinite. Why? Infinite desire was created for an infinite God. However, because of the fall of humanity, because we've fallen away from Him and our own sin, we have fallen away from the infinite God, but we still have infinite desires. The problem is we try to satisfy them in finite ways. And so that's why we are restless. Our hearts are restless because we have infinite desires for an infinite God, but without the infinite God, we have infinite desires and finite things, leaving us restless. And so we have this restless life that we struggle with. In the words of that great theologian Mick Jagger, I can't get no. Yeah, okay, you believe that too, right? That's good theology, because we are restless people. And this leads to a life of hurry and busyness and overload and materialism and workaholism and careerism, always wanting more. And yet Jesus shows us the way of rest. Jesus was always busy, but he was never hurried. He knew the way of rest. In Mark chapter 6, verse 30, he had just sent out the apostles on mission, and they come back to report to him. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, Jesus, said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Isn't it good to know that it's good to rest? These guys were on mission. They came back, and people were still pulling on them. Jesus said, okay, the mission's important, but you have to have times where you rest. He commands them. He says, you must come with me and rest. The old King James put it this way, "Come ye yourselves apart." Or as Dallas Willard said, if you don't come apart for a while, you will come apart after a while. If we don't come apart and make space in our life for rest, we will come apart. We need rest. And Jesus had this great rhythm of retreat, rest, and then he would actually go back and return. Retreat, rest, return on the mission. And so we're to follow the way of Jesus. When we follow the way of Jesus, he leads us to rest. We already saw this in Matthew 11:28. "Come to me," he said, "all you're weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." And so it's good news today that we have a Lord that wants to lead us to rest. This series is all about that, called Space. We're talking about how do we create space to rest so we can go back and engage in mission. How do we actually create this space in our lives to experience rest? And we said in the series, Jesus made space to go to a place, see God's face, to set his pace. I know that's cheesy, but I rhymed it for a reason, because I wanted that to be a memory aid for you, that Jesus made space go to a place, seek God's face, that he might have a pace that God sets himself for him. At Life Church, we talk about bold habits, B-O-L-D. The two middle habits, observe and obey the Spirit, learn and live Jesus. These two middle bold habits is what the series is about. How do we create space? And we're in that space, we are observing, and we can obey the Spirit. Well, we can learn the life of Jesus, so when we go back on mission, we can live that life of Jesus. How do we do that? And so we're in the series talking about creating space for that very thing. The old-timers called it a rule of life. They called it a rule of life, a set of practices or spiritual disciplines that make space for our lives by providing structure, support, and strength for life with God. So I'm hoping this imagery also sticks in your mind, because the word rule, regula, was used initially for these stakes or these supports that plants would grow up in. And the imagery is we need to have this structure and this support to strengthen us to allow for what? Fruit to develop in our lives. In fact, regula, we get the English word regular. Spiritual disciplines are regular patterns to create space for fruit to grow and thrive in our lives. And we talked about two spiritual disciplines, solitude, and we talked about silence. Solitude, meeting with God; silence, listening to God. And we talked last time about that, and if you weren't there, you should listen to it online, because we talked about how to hear from God. How can we hear from God? And we talked about in meeting with God through prayer, through scripture reading. In solitude and silence, God can speak to us. Today, we talk about another spiritual discipline, and two more actually. We're going to spend 98% of our time on the first one. But two spiritual disciplines, but the first one we're going to talk about is something that mitigates the rush of life. It's the most effective spiritual practice for slowing down your life. For all those who would say, man, I need to slow down, you need to listen, because this is the game changer. And it is what's called Sabbath. Stopping, resting, worshiping, and celebrating one day a week. Now, I'm still learning Sabbath. I've violated the Sabbath most of my life. Still learning how to do this. It's hard, but the word for Sabbath, the Hebrew word, is Shabbat, and it means to cease, to stop, right? To desist, to rest. It means slamming on the brakes. In the age of restlessness, this is something to give us restfulness, to slow and to stop. And just as volleyball practice is needed for the game, marching band practice is needed for the performance, in the same way, Sabbath is needed for pace. It's about muscle memory. You practice volleyball to play well, you practice marching band to perform well, and you practice Sabbath to live well. And if we're not practicing, we don't live as well. And these four actions are very important. No matter who you read, and all the spiritual giants, they use different words, but it's all the four same things. Right? You need to stop, cease. That's what the word Shabbat means. You need to rest. That means no activity. Now, it doesn't mean no activity. It means no hard, heavy activity. It might be working in a garden. It might be going for a hike. It might be some light landscaping. It might be just sitting and drinking coffee. It might be, but there needs to be some resting. Worshiping is important, because if you're only basically stopping and resting, that's a day off. But Sabbath is more than a day off. Worshiping means that we worship. Now, as much as I love our worship team, and they were awesome, they are always awesome, worshiping on Sabbath is more than just singing songs. It is whole life orientation toward God. It's really what Romans 12 talks about being a living sacrifice, which is proper worship. It's a lifestyle of thinking about Him. And so we're thinking about God, and then celebrating. Wonder, awe, joy, the things you miss when you're rushing. When you slow down, you can wonder about things, have awe in things, have bold fun. Right? Celebrate is so important. Now, Sabbath is not meant to be legalistic. It's not meant to be something, a rule or regulation you must do. It's meant to be life-giving. And your Sabbath looks different than my Sabbath. Why? Because different personalities, different life stages, different interests. But all of us should have a time of Sabbath. And these words are very important, these 4 words, these 4 actions. Now, when it comes to when you practice it, it's up to you. Judaism practiced it from 6 p.m. on Friday to 6 p.m. on Saturday, part of 2 days. But the day is not important. On the screen, you see Colossians 2:16 and Romans 14:5. What do they say? Don't let people judge you on all kinds of things, including Sabbath days. And one person considers one day sacred, another day sacred. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. And so you might have a different day than I have. Sunday's a good day for a lot of people for their Sabbath. But you got to find out what day is your Sabbath. What 24-hour period block are you going to try to experience Sabbath? Jesus one day was walking on the Sabbath and walking around, and he healed a paralyzed person. He picked some grain in a wheat field because he was hungry, eating a snack. And some hardcore Sabbatarians called Pharisees came up and says, Jesus, you're doing Sabbath wrong. You can't heal someone. You're supposed to be resting. Yes. Because what Sabbatarians do, legalists do, they put a wall around the commands of God, and they add all kinds of rules around the commands of God. In fact, what the Pharisees do, there are 39 Hebrew words in the 4th commandment about Sabbath. They took the 39 words and multiply that times 39 and got 1,521 words, 21, and they created 1,521 rules on how to keep the Sabbath. These are real rules they produced. Example, you cannot rescue a drowning man on the Sabbath. Good luck with that. Don't go swimming on your Sabbath, okay? You can't slap a flea on the Sabbath. Why? It's considered fighting. You can't carry anything heavier than a dried fig. Ridiculous, right? All these rules. Sabbath wasn't a blessing, it was a burden. They actually thought that we were created somehow to honor all these things. And Jesus, when they pressed on him, they had 6 run-ins with Jesus about the Sabbath. He finally had enough, and in Mark 2:27, he says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, me, the Messiah, is Lord even of the Sabbath. He says, you guys got it all wrong. You got it reversed. You need to flip the script. He said, you actually believe we were created for Sabbath. No, Sabbath was created for us. Not to be a burden, but to be a blessing. Not for legalism, but for life. I, the Son of Man, the Messiah, I am Lord of Sabbath. And he spoke with authority. And so Exodus 16:29 reminds us they must realize that the Sabbath is the Lord's gift. The Sabbath is the Lord's gift. It's the Lord's gift to us. Exodus 20 verse 8 says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Think about that for a moment. This day is holy. This was new information to those hearers who heard this. Why? Because in that day and time, they actually thought that what was holy was places. Holy mountain, holy temple, holy shrine, holy city. What they didn't think was holy was time. And yet, as the great Rabbi Abraham Heschel has reminded us, he said, Sabbath is the redemption of time. When you spend a Sabbath, if you're a workaholic like I was for years, if you are a busybody and you're just running through life rushed, you think Sabbath's a waste of time. But Heschel reminds us it's not a waste of time, it's redeeming the time. It's doing something in that space of 24 hours to time. It's changing time. It's transforming time. Society around me is driven by temporal time, but Sabbath inside me is directed by eternal time. If you ever take a Sabbath, then you're just being controlled and pushed here and flow. We are dominated by temporal time. Deadlines are rushing around. But if you create that space that 24-hour space once a week. All of a sudden, now you're not driven by temporal time, you're directed by eternal time, and you're able to actually look outside and see when Jesus says, when Paul says, raise your thoughts on things above. We see the kingdom. We see God. We see things differently when we actually live that way. We're able to stop and rest and worship and celebrate in those moments. A confession I have, I've already said it in this message, for years I never took the Sabbath seriously. Most of my life I've not done that. Why do we do that? Why do we struggle with Sabbath? There's insight in the book of Ezekiel when God was rebuking the nation of Israel. Ezekiel 20, verse 16, because they rejected my laws, God speaking, and did not follow my decrees and desecrated my Sabbaths. For their hearts, here's the reason, their hearts were devoted to their idols. Verse 20, keep my Sabbaths holy, that they may be a sign between us. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. Sabbath is a sign. The eternal time we live in, where we know that we're God's. We're stopping, we're resting, we're worshiping, we're celebrating. We know that we are His. It's an important time. But yet many of us are not. The reason we're desecrating the Sabbath is because we're devoted to idols. Unfortunately, our idolatry causes us to neglect Sabbath. For years, I worshiped work. That idolatry caused me to neglect Sabbath. As Americans, we are addicted to what? Accomplishing, addicted to accumulating. And because we want to accomplish and accumulate, we are running here and there, and we are wearing ourselves out. And yet, that idolatry causes us to miss out on Sabbath. I want to remind you today about three things that Sabbath is rooted in. We must remember that Sabbath is rooted in three things, three broad roots of Sabbath. The first is we find in Genesis 2:1, where it says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work He had been doing. On the seventh day, He rested from all His work. Then God blessed the seventh day, made it holy, because on it He rested from all the work of creating that He had done. God creates work. In Genesis 1, ordains it. Work is good. But even though we work and it's good, we still need rest. So in Genesis 2, He talks about the importance here of working and then resting. He calls it holy. That means to be set apart, to be dedicated. This is the first time the word holy is ever mentioned in the Bible. Theologians call this first reference. Of the 600 plus times the word holy is found in the Bible, the very first thing that God calls holy is Sabbath, seventh day. And God rested. Yeah, but Pastor, I own my own business. I can't take a day off. God rested. I got 3 preschool kids. I can't slow down. God rested. I'm a driven personality. I just can't sit still. God rested. Do you think it took a lot of work to create the entire cosmos and then to run it? Yes or no? And yet God rested. Is anybody busier than God? The whole point is, He says we need to rest. So we have creation. I confess my limitations and I rest. I confess my limitations. I confess that I'm not God. I confess I'm only human. I confess my humanity. And I confess my limitations. I can't do it all. And I rest. So this idea, this root, is creation. That we have limitations, that we must rest. It's the rhythm and DNA of the created order. You can't go against that. As one Christian philosopher said, if you go against the grain of the universe, you get splinters. Anybody got splinters in the house today? Trying to go against the grain of that one 24-hour period of rest. The Supreme Court has already said it's legal for there to be laws for businesses to be closed on a Sabbath day. Not for religious reasons solely, but also for health reasons. Studies have shown that reasonable breaks during the day increases productivity. The old saying is, you break the bow if it's always bent. You got to let the bow rest sometimes. Consult your history. During the French Revolution, they went to a 10-day work week. Everybody worked 10 days before they could take a day off. It was disastrous. Productivity plummeted during that time. The Russian communists tried to produce what they called the super worker, went to a 10-day work week. Productivity plummeted. They had to go back off of it. Henry Ford even experimented with a 7-day work week in America, and he also realized how productivity went down. Study after study verifies there is no correlation between hurry and productivity. Once you reach a certain number of hours in the week, you lose productivity. Anybody want to guess how many hours that is? It's 50, which ironically is a 6-day work week. Work 6, the Bible says what? And take off 1. Now we do a double. We actually take off 2. But one's a day off and one should be a Sabbath. They're different, right? And so the whole point here is we are to, anything beyond 50, we are not being very productive. Our bodies are telling us something here. You might say, I didn't think God had to rest. He isn't tired, doesn't sleep, doesn't slumber. Yeah, he doesn't. God doesn't really rest. But he did Shabbat. He ceased. He stopped. He set this pattern into the created order. And so this is your biblical proof text to have a Sunday afternoon nap, right? The Jews called it the Sabbath Sluff. It's a Sunday nap, a Sabbath nap. Sabbath Sluff. So go take your Sabbath Sluff today and get your Sabbath nap in. And he blessed the Sabbath, the scripture says. He blessed it. Only 3 things are blessed in the creation account. Animals, be fruitful and increase in number. Humans, be fruitful and increase in number. And the Sabbath. All 3 of those involve the same thing, being fruitful and increasing in life. Sabbath procreates life. Sabbath puts life into the world. God blesses everything that is fruitful and increases life. If you want a world full of life, there needs to be Sabbath. So important. A survey was done by a doctor, and he was trying to figure out who lives the most fulfilled life. And he did a survey of all these people, and he realized one group of people are more fulfilled, or not the most fulfilled, but high on the list, and that is Seventh-day Adventists. Anybody know what that is? It's a Christian denomination that has Sabbath in its name, right? They worship on Saturday because they think that's the Jewish Sabbath. They're trying to do that, right? Well, they're taking Sabbath seriously, and so, but they're the most fulfilled. But the doctor also found something else. Not only do they live better, they live longer. He found that people who are Seventh-day Adventists lived on average 10 years longer than the average American. Isn't that something? 10 years longer, people who practice Sabbath. And if you do the math, here's the math. If you practice Sabbath throughout your life, if you live one 24-hour period where you're stopping and you're resting and you're worshiping and you are celebrating, if you do that once, you don't have to add up all those 24 hours over a lifespan. You know how long it is? 10 years. These guys are kind of onto something here. Why? We are admitting our limitations. We live better and we live longer when we practice Sabbath. As Willard said a few weeks ago, remember what he said? He said in that quote we gave that the only way to stop busyness is either solitude or tragedy. You can rephrase that. You also can stop busyness with Sabbath or tragedy. In other words, if you keep running, you're going to be flat on your back. That's tragedy. Let's be more intentional and take solitude, silence, and Sabbath seriously. Create that space that we might live better and live longer and stay on mission. Exodus 31:17 says, "For 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the 7th day he rested and was refreshed." Anybody want to be refreshed today? Sabbath gives you that. It's kind of like the car manual you have for your car. There's a maintenance schedule in there. Right? If you follow the maintenance schedule, your car will last longer. The Bible is the user manual of the car. And in the Bible is a maintenance schedule, and it's called Sabbath. If you want to live better and longer, we practice Sabbath. So it's rooted in creation, but it's also rooted in something else. Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you or your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. Everybody's off. 4, here's the reason. In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. He goes back to creation. The sea and all that's in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The people will get out of Egyptian slavery. They're circled around Mount Sinai. They're not slaves, but they're the people of God now. What does it mean to be the people of God? He said, well, I'll give you these commandments. I'll tell you how to be my people. And one of those commandments is Sabbath. And interestingly enough, more space is given to remembering the Sabbath than any other command. The words of the fourth commandment take up 30% of the space of the words of the 10 commandments. More said about Sabbath than not killing people. They're not lying, right? They're not stealing or coveting. Why, it's very, very important. Now, when people say, well, Pastor, I get all that, but we live under grace, not under law. I get that too. That's very true. We're no longer, the 10 Commandments are no longer binding on us in the sense we don't have to obey the Old Testament law to be right with God and go to heaven. Why? Jesus already met the requirements of the law on the cross. When you believe in him, those requirements are fulfilled in him and then vicariously through you because you believe in Jesus. So we live by grace, not by law. I get all that. But Jesus also said, I did not come to abolish the law, but what? To fulfill the law. And here's the deal. The moral commands of the Old Testament are still something we follow. Anybody believes it's okay to murder, okay to steal, okay to lie? My guess is you'll agree with at least 9 of the 10 commandments. How about 10? How about Sabbath? It won't get you into heaven, but it'll get heaven into you. Living a life that's different. And here we're talking about commandment. I trust God to give me life. Creation was about limitations and needing to rest. But this next root is about commandment. God's commanded us, and the question is, will we trust God? And why do we say that? Because in an agrarian society, them not working that one day, they were losing 15% of their income. They had to trust God to provide that day they weren't working. Remember when they were wandering around in the wilderness and God fed them miraculously through manna? Remember how much on Fridays God would give them 2 days of manna? Remember that? And they'd pick it up. Why? Because on Saturday they weren't supposed to work. Do you trust God to provide for you during the 6th so you can Sabbath during the 7th? Do you trust God to provide for you? Are you so into the idolatry of accumulating, right, and accomplishing that you cannot do that? I encourage us to speak to us today that we can trust God to take that time off from work. And this whole Sabbath principle was not just weekly. They would use it not just the 7th day of the week. Every 7th year, they would give the fields a day off or a year off, right? They would tell the fields, they tell the farmers, hey, your fields out there, don't plant anything. Don't plant things in your fields, he said, during the 7th year. Why? He wanted those fields to actually rest so they could be more fruitful. And on the screen behind me, you see some field. And here's the whole point. If God cares about dirt, don't you think he cares about you, right? If he's going to give a field some time off, he's going to give you some time off. And so we must learn to rest. I like what Pete Scazzaro said. He said, work requires something of us. It depletes our energies, our wisdom, our reserves. If we don't allow the soil of our souls to rest, we do violence to ourselves. The dirt must take some time off to be fruitful. We must take time off to be fruitful. And so the Sabbath is rooted in creation. It's rooted in commandment. It's rooted in one more thing. Deuteronomy 5:12. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. As the Lord your God commanded you, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On you shall not do any work. And he goes through a whole long line of the same exact thing he said in the book of Exodus. But verse 15 he says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought you out of there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So this isn't about creation or commandment. This is about covenant. I live free as a son or daughter of God, not a slave of the world. This one is so important. Creation is about knowing my limitations, resting. Commandment is about trusting God and submitting to Him. But covenant is about realizing I am no longer a slave. He gave them the 10 Commandments, we read a while ago in Exodus, when they were actually just came out of slavery. And he gave them the 10 Commandments. And there, it was rooted there actually in the creation, saying, hey, you need to rest and obey me and submit to me, trust me. But then remember, 40 years passed. They didn't go in the promised land right away. 40 years passes, and they're about to go in the promised land now. And and of course, many of those, in fact, most of those who heard the commandments were now dead at Mount Sinai. Now they're about to go in, so he does a refresher called the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy means second law. Does a refresher on them, and he talks about the importance of the 10 Commandments. But in Exodus, he rooted it into the creation. You need to rest. You have limitations. So trust me. In Deuteronomy, he roots it into covenant. You are now my people. You're no longer slaves. And why is this so important? This is so important because it's rooted in our very identity. The reason we are driven to accomplish and driven to accumulate. We have this idolatry in us that drives us. We are slaves to our stuff. I've got to be the right person, do the right things, and I've got to earn the right money. And we are busy and we're running, and we have this restlessness about us. And yet, Jesus, or the Old Testament says, Deuteronomy says, those things do not have to be your master. Now you are no longer a slave to all these things that make us so restless. In fact, one theologian called it an act of resistance, Sabbath. He said, take a Sabbath, because in Deuteronomy, he said, it's an act of resistance. Stick it to the man, right? Stick it to Pharaoh. We're not slaves anymore. Stick it to the evil one. You don't have me in bondage anymore. I am not a slave of the evil one. I am a son or daughter of God. I'm not a slave of things that drive me and give me restlessness. I am a son or daughter of God. I'm no longer under Pharaoh's whip. I am under Jesus' yoke. And so I'm his son. I'm his daughter, the daughter of God. And so we don't have to do more, get more, and be more. We're slaves to that. But now we are free to be his people. Is anyone glad about that? When I make the space, I'm reminding myself of the created order. I have limitations. When I make the space a Sabbath, I'm reminded of the commandment. Do I trust him? When I make the space of Sabbath, I remember that I'm not a slave. I don't have to be a workaholic, driven by my work, because I'm a son of the King. And so that drives us. The Lord is my shepherd, right? I shall not want. He leads me beside quiet waters. He guides me in paths of righteousness. Hear that? He leads. He guides. Friends, Jesus leads. Satan drives. If you feel driven, let me tell you, that's not Jesus. And if we are driven, running around, frantic, that is not Jesus. That is the evil one. And he says we are free from that. The crazy thing was, if you read the story, there are many times they want to go back into slavery. Remember the story? They want to go back. They said, oh, it's hard out here in the desert. Let's go back into slavery. There's something within us. It's like that idolatry within us that pulls us back into a driven life. We want the master. We don't really want it, but for some reason, we're craving it because of our idolatry. But in Sabbath, we're able to create that distance and that space where there's differentiation between who I am and what I do. You are not what you do. You are a child of God. It's about being and not just doing. I like what Old Testament theologian and scholar Walter Brueggemann said. He said, people who keep Sabbath live all 7 days differently. Isn't that a good word? If you keep Sabbath one day, it affects all the other days. Why? Because Sabbath one day slows everything down. That, remember, you create space to go to a place to seek his face, to set your pace. It changes your pace all throughout the week. Makes you live not by a spirit of restlessness, but a spirit of restfulness. It's like the governor in your car that keeps the speed at a certain level. Sabbath does that for us. You know, Jesus would often heal on the Sabbath. In fact, I like what John Mark Comer says. Do you know that almost all of Jesus' healings take place on the Sabbath? I don't think that's a coincidence. Why? Because the Sabbath is a day for healing. That was true in the first century, and I would argue it's true today. Anyone need transformation, healing today? Healing is found in Sabbath. In that space, Sabbath and healing can come. So Hebrews 4:9 says, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will fall. The irony is we must work to enter rest. We are to work hard to rest well. Make every effort to enter rest. Why? He says, so that, he says, no one will fail. The way to stay strong spiritually is to rest. It's like soldiers in a battle. Sometimes they retreat in a battle, and why? Too much ground's being lost, or they're tired, or they're overwhelmed, or too many casualties, or they need a new strategy. But they retreat. We think retreat's a negative term. Retreat. We think it's negative. It's actually positive. Because in that retreat, there's an opportunity for what? For rest, to tend to the wounded, to stop the enemy's momentum, to get a wider view of life and strategize again, to get away from the fog of war. For years, I walked around the fog of war 24/7, and many of you are in the fog of war now. But Sabbath, retreat, gets you away from the front lines just for a little bit. Yes, we're called to go on mission, but before we go on mission, we have to have the seasons of retreat, in and out, retreat and return, retreat and return, that we might be the people God is calling us to be. Sabbath. Second discipline, I'm just going to put on the screen, then we'll close, is service. Practicing the humble ministry of Jesus. What many of you guys did yesterday. Mark 10:45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. Galatians 5:13, you, my brothers and sisters, are called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh, just for yourself, but serve one another humbly in love. And so, Sabbath and service go together. We have space for solitude, for silence, for Sabbath, and during that time of retreat, we're re-envisioned, recalled, and we sit back out on mission. If you're not living on mission, it's a good chance you're not having Sabbath, because you have to have those moments of retreat before you step out and to have the ministry of Jesus. So we were made to work hard through Jesus and rest well in Jesus. Will you work hard in Him? Will you rest well in Him? Will you serve? And will you Sabbath? Close with two questions. When is my Sabbath and where is my Sabbath? So when? I asked you last time, when's your solitude? When's your silence? Now, when's your Sabbath? What 24-hour period will be your Sabbath? Write that down on your outline. Type it in. And where is my service? Where are you serving? I don't need to spend a lot of time on service today. We talk about service all the time at Life Church. But we need solitude, we need silence, we need Sabbath, and we need service. Father, we thank you so much just for the teaching of Scripture and how it calls us to a life that slows us down, that we might be able to seek you and stay on mission. Lord, I pray this series will be life-changing. I've already heard many stories, so thankful for them. And Lord, as we get serious about solitude and silence and Sabbath, Lord, may we be re-envisioned for service, to be on mission for you. We thank you that, Lord, for all that you're doing in this church, and Lord, how you are going to use this church to continue blessing our city in Christ's name.